What would you do if your boss called you a slave in front of everyone? For Brian Daniels, that moment wasn't the end. It was a spark that lit a fire, one that would shake his workplace and reach far beyond it. The morning sun poured through tall glass windows in a sleek, open office in Austin, Texas. The soft tapping of keyboards filled the air, mixed with quiet laughter from coworkers trading small talk. It seemed like just another Monday. But for Brian, this day already felt heavy. Every morning at work was a battle he couldn't escape. Brian Daniels, a 34-year-old black man known for his sharp suits and quiet determination, had spent 5 years at Bexley & Coombe. To him, this wasn't just a paycheck. It was his chance to break through the barriers that held back generations before him. His family believed in the power of hard work, and Brian lived by that belief. But lately, he felt his effort crumbling under the weight of unspoken tension. That tension had a name, Annette Sullivan. Annette, his manager, was sharp, ambitious, and known for climbing the corporate ladder fast. To many, she was proof that hard work paid off. But to Brian, she had become the source of constant, cutting hostility. It started small, her dismissive tone, ignoring his ideas in meetings, making sure his mistakes were louder than anyone else's. Over time, it grew harder to ignore. For Brian, every interaction with her felt like walking a tightrope, where one wrong move could send him crashing down. That morning, Brian walked into the office holding his coffee, mentally bracing for the day. He had a big presentation ahead, one he had spent weeks perfecting. But when he reached his desk, he froze. His slides had been changed, his careful points stripped away, replaced with shallow bullet notes. And at the bottom, Annette's initials. Frustration burned inside him, but he stayed calm. This wasn't the first time she'd taken credit for his work. And Brian knew calling her out would only backfire. Still, this time felt different. He couldn't just let it slide. "Good morning, Brian." Annette's voice cut through the office like a knife. She stood at his desk, arms crossed, a smug smile on her face. "I made a few changes to your slides. They were a bit too complicated." Brian looked up, meeting her gaze with calm he didn't fully feel. "I see that," he replied evenly. "I would have appreciated a heads up before you changed them." Her smile faltered for a second, then came back sharper than before. "Well, that's why I'm the manager. I know what works for our clients." It was a subtle jab, but it hit hard. Brian clenched his jaw and stayed silent. He knew better than to argue in the middle of the office. Still, something deep down told him that today, something was going to snap. The hours dragged on as Brian prepared for his presentation, frustration simmering beneath his calm surface. He had learned to choose his battles wisely, because every clash in the workplace carried a hidden cost. By the time the team gathered in the conference room, the tension was thick. Brian adjusted his tie and set up the slides, determined to make the best of what was left of his work. Annette leaned casually against the doorway, tea in hand, radiating superiority. Colleagues filled the room, chatting, scrolling their phones, flipping through notes. Annette clapped her hands. "Let's get started. Brian, the floor is yours." Her tone was clipped, dismissive. Brian took a deep breath and began. Despite the edits, he spoke with clarity and confidence, weaving back in the details Annette had stripped away. Heads nodded around the table, his co-workers clearly impressed by his knowledge. But Annette's icy stare told a different story. She cut him off twice with unnecessary questions, not to clarify, but to undercut him. Still, Brian pressed on, refusing to give her control. When he wrapped up, the room broke into applause. "Great job, Brian. That was really insightful," Vanessa, one of his colleagues, said. Annette's smile was thin, her words dripping with condescension. "Yes, well, it seems Brian had some help with this. The team effort really shines through." The jab stung, but Brian kept his face neutral. The meeting ended. People drifted out, and Annette stopped him. "A word in my office," she said flatly. Her office was cold, just like her. She motioned for him to sit. Brian stayed standing. He could feel this wouldn't be a casual talk. "Let's get to the point," Annette said, her voice hard. "You've been walking a fine line lately, and I need to remind you who's in charge." The way you handled that presentation, borderline insubordination. Brian blinked in disbelief. Insubordination? For giving a presentation well? Annette's eyes narrowed. For going beyond what was necessary. You made me look incompetent in front of the team. The accusation hung heavy in the air. Brian couldn't believe what he was hearing. With all due respect, Annette, I only wanted to show the full scope of my work, he said carefully. Her voice rose, sharp and cutting. Don't forget your place, Brian. You're not the one making decisions. You do the work you're told to do, and you leave the thinking to people like me. The phrase people like me lingered in the air like poison. Something inside Brian snapped. Excuse me, he asked, his voice calm but edged with disbelief. Annette didn't back down. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. You know exactly what I mean. You're here to follow orders, not play the hero. Or have you forgotten where you come from? The room seemed to freeze. The air grew heavy, charged with tension. Then Annette crossed an invisible line. She didn't even notice. You're nothing more than a glorified slave in this office. The words exploded like thunder. Brian's chest tightened. His fists clenched at his sides. He stayed silent for a moment, forcing himself to breathe, forcing himself not to give in to the storm inside him. But he knew he couldn't stay quiet. When he finally spoke, it would be a moment no one would forget. Brian took a deep breath. Anger burned hot in his chest, but he knew rage wasn't the answer. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been belittled, disrespected, or dehumanized. He stepped closer to her desk, his voice steady but carrying the weight of generations. Annette, he began, calm yet cutting. What you just said isn't only offensive. It's unacceptable. And I won't stand here and let you degrade me or anyone else like that. For the first time, Annette leaned back in her chair, a flicker of unease on her face. You're being dramatic, she muttered, but her voice lacked its usual edge. Brian shook his head. No, I'm being truthful. Let me tell you something. Annette, my great-grandfather worked himself to the bone as a sharecropper in Mississippi. He picked cotton for pay that barely kept his family alive, but he dreamed of a better life for his children. My grandfather marched in Selma. He fought for the right to vote and never stopped believing in equality. And my father spent his life teaching me that no matter how much the world tries to tear you down, you keep pushing forward, because your worth isn't defined by someone else's prejudice. The room was silent. It felt as if even the air had stopped moving. Brian's voice grew stronger, sharper, more resolute. I didn't come here to be anyone's punching bag. I've worked hard, harder than you can imagine, to be where I am today. And no matter how much you try to belittle me, you can't take that away. Annette opened her mouth to cut him off, but Brian raised his hand. No, you don't get to interrupt this time. You've had your say. Now it's my turn. He turned toward the office window, eyes fixed on the busy street below. Do you know how exhausting it is to walk into a place every day, knowing you're judged, not by your skills or your work ethic, but by the color of your skin? To carry the weight of stereotypes and assumptions everywhere you go? And still, I show up. I show up because I refuse to let people like you define my story. He turned back to her, his eyes blazing with determination. I deserve respect, Annette, not because of my title, not because of my credentials, but because I'm a human being. And so does everyone else in this office. He stepped closer, his voice low but commanding. What you said wasn't just cruel. It was a reflection of something deeper, something this company needs to face. Because if this is the culture you're building, then it's time for a change. At that moment, the door to Annette's office creaked open. Several coworkers stood there, their faces a mix of shock and admiration. They had heard everything. Vanessa stepped forward, her voice trembling but steady. Brian, that was incredible. And you're absolutely right. This has gone on for far too long. One by one, the others nodded. The air in the office had shifted. Unspoken truths had been forced into the open. But Brian knew this was just beginning. The real battle was still ahead. As he stepped out of Annette's office, silence filled the workplace. His co-workers' faces showed a storm of emotions, shock, discomfort, guilt for some, and admiration for many. Brian didn't know what would come next, but he knew there was no turning back. Inside her office, Annette sat frozen, her face caught between anger and disbelief. She had underestimated him. And for the first time, she seemed to realize she had crossed a line she couldn't erase. Brian's pulse was still racing as he walked back to his desk. His hands trembled slightly. He had spoken the truth, but part of him wondered how the company would react. Would they ignore it? Or finally face the deeper problems that had been swept aside for years? That afternoon, an email from Human Resources hit everyone's inbox. Subject line: immediate meeting, workplace conduct. Brian's stomach tightened as he opened it. The meeting was set for 3 p.m. mandatory for all staff. By the time the room filled, the tension was thick. Annette sat stiffly at the head of the table, her usual authority replaced with discomfort. At the front stood Elena Chavez, the HR director, a calm but firm presence. She wasted no time. Good afternoon. As some of you know, an incident happened today that raised serious concerns about our workplace culture. We're here to address it. Her eyes scanned the room before landing on Brian. First, I want to thank Brian for his courage in speaking up. It takes real strength to confront injustice, especially when it's been allowed to go unchecked. Annette shifted in her seat, but stayed silent. What happened today is unacceptable, Elena continued. Let me be clear, Bexley and Company has zero tolerance for discrimination or harassment. An internal investigation has already begun, and actions will follow. The room went still. For the first time, Brian felt a flicker of hope, not just for himself, but for everyone who had suffered in silence. After the meeting, coworkers approached him one by one. Brian, I'm so sorry, Vanessa said, her voice thick with emotion. I should have spoken up sooner. I saw how she treated you, and I stayed quiet. That's on me. Another colleague, Kevin added, Man, I don't even know what to say. You stood up for all of us today, whether we realized it or not. Brian accepted their words with grace, but he reminded them, this isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else has to go through this. If we want change, it has to come from all of us. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Annette was placed on administrative leave. Whispers about her spread quickly. Stories came out. Others she had belittled, ignored, or mistreated. But until now, they had been too afraid to speak. Brian didn't gloat. He stayed focused on what mattered most, turning this into something bigger. Real change. Weeks passed, and slowly, the atmosphere began to shift. Conversations that were once avoided started happening openly. HR launched new initiatives, bringing in experts to lead workshops on bias, inclusion, and respect. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and Brian became an unexpected leader. Co-workers sought him out for guidance. In meetings, his voice carried new weight. He wasn't just a man who stood up to Annette. He had become a symbol of resilience, proof that one act of courage could ripple outward. When the investigation ended, Annette was terminated. The company issued a public statement, apologizing for the incident and promising to build a better workplace. For Brian, the news was bittersweet. He didn't celebrate her downfall. Instead, he thought about the bigger picture. One afternoon, Elena approached him. We'd like to start a diversity council, she said. And I think you'd be the perfect person to lead it. You've shown strength we can all learn from. We want voices like yours at the center of this company's future. Brian hesitated, the weight of responsibility settling on him. But when he looked around at his co-workers, their faces a mix of hope and uncertainty, he knew his answer. I'd be honored, he said. But this isn't about me. Everyone here needs to feel like their voice matters. The council's first meeting became a turning point. Employees shared stories, some painful, others inspiring. They talked about fair hiring, equal opportunities, and building a culture where everyone felt valued. Brian listened, took notes, and made sure no voice was ignored. Beyond the office, Brian's story spread into the community. He was invited to speak at local events, encouraging others to challenge injustice wherever they found it. His message was simple. Change doesn't happen in silence. It happens when we have the courage to speak up, even when it's hard. Over time, Bexley and Company became a case study in transformation. Mistakes were made and progress was slow, but the company's commitment to growth was real. For Brian, the journey was far from finished. But one morning, as he walked into the office and was greeted with nods and warm smiles, he felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. He had taken a stand, and it had mattered. And to anyone hearing his story, remember this: your voice is your power. Speak up, even when it's uncomfortable. Challenge prejudice wherever you find it, because real change begins with courage, and courage begins with you.